What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. As well as our second channel sponsor, the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. If you're ever in town, be sure to stop in and say hi to Martin. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're not only bringing you the first game of Season 4, but also the channel's 100th episode. So we'd like to quickly thank everyone who has supported us over the last 2 years. This week's matchup features Patrick playing the original NYAM gambler, Mayael the Anima, Martin playing his Unfinity commander, Magar with the Magic Strings, Foggerl playing his Toxic Bro deck being led by Brokkos, Apex of Forever, and finally Foil playing his Werewolf Tribal deck with Tovolar, Dire Overlord. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Patrick plays an Arid Mesa before paying a life to crack it in order to go get a land from his library. Martin plays a Mountain for turn and then pays 1 to cast the first turn 1 Soul Ring of the season. Fog plays a Forest and then Foil plays a tapped Gruul Guildgate. Patrick finally finds his land and then draws for turn. He then plays a tapped Temple of Triumph, which has him scrying one card to the bottom of his library. Martin draws for turn and plays a Swamp before tapping out in order to cast his commander on turn 2. Fog plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 to cast an Arcane Signet. Foil plays a Mountain for turn and then pays 2 to foretell a card before passing. Patrick draws and then plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth before also tapping out in order to cast his commander, Mayael the Anima. Martin plays another Mountain for turn before paying 3 in order to cast Creeping Chill, which has each opponent losing 3 life while he gains 3 life. Martin then goes to combat swing his commander Patrick, giving the first blood of the season. Fog plays another Island for turn before tapping out in order to cast an Urborg Lagoyf, Kick Twice, which has him milling 6 cards from the top of his library into his graveyard. Foil plays a Mountain for turn and then taps out to cast his commander Tovolar, which has becoming daytime when he enters play. Patrick draws and plays a Pillar Verge Pathway passing turn, which then has Foil's commander transforming as nighttime becomes daytime. Martin plays another Swamp for turn before he then taps out in order to cast a Baleful Mastery, which he then replicates by flashing in a Dualcaster Mage. He then chooses to target Patrick and Foil's commander, and in response, Patrick casts a Semester's End in order to exile his commander until end of turn. Foil's commander then gets exiled, and Martin chooses to have Fog draw 2 cards out of the kindness of his heart. Martin then swings his commander at Foil for 3 commander damage and passes turn, and on his end step, Patrick's commander comes back into play with an additional 1/1 counter. Fog plays a Forest for turn and then pays 3 along with paying 2 life in order to cast a Tezzeret's Gambit, which has him drawing 2 cards. Fog then pays 2 and casts a Branchblight Stalker and passes his turn. Foil plays a Forest for turn and then pays 2 to cast a Lignify targeting Martin's commander, before he then pays an additional 2 to cast his Foretell card, which has him drawing a card when he enters play. Patrick plays a land for turn and then taps out in order to cast a Silverback Elder before passing turn. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Cathartic Reunion, which has him discarding 2 cards in order to draw 3 new ones. He then pays 2 and casts an Obliterating Bolt in order to destroy Foil's Wolf. He then goes to combat and swings 2 damage at Foil to prove a point before passing turn. Fog plays another Force for turn before he then pays 5 in order to mutate his commander onto his elf. He then goes to combat and he swings his commander at Martin, who blocks with his Lignified commander, but still takes 2 trample commander damage along with getting 2 poison counters. Foil draws and then casts a Cemetery Prowler, which has him exiling an instant card from Martin's graveyard. Patrick plays a command tower for turn before then paying 6 in order to cast a Flame Blast Dragon, which then triggers his Silverback Elder, puts a land into play tapped. He then bottoms the rest of the cards while passing the turn to Martin. Martin plays a Swamp for turn and then casts an Angrass Rampage targeting Patrick, having him sacrifice one of his creatures, before he then pays in order to cast his commander a second time. Fog casts a Knight's Whisper for turn, which has him losing 2 life and drawing 2 cards. He then plays an Evolving Wilds as his land for turn before paying 3 for a Glistening Sphere, which comes into play tapped and proliferates Martin's poison counters. He then goes to combat attacking Martin, giving him 6 more commander damage as well as 2 more poison counters. He then cracks his Evolving Wilds to go get a swamp while he passes. Foil plays a tapped Valakut Stoneforge for turn and then goes to combat swinging his Wolfit Fog, which then has him losing 3 life and exiling a card from his graveyard. Foil then casts a Pirate's Pillage, which has him discarding a card, drawing 2 cards, and then creating 2 treasure tokens. Foil then casts his own Cathartic Reunion, which has him discarding 2 cards and drawing 3 new cards, before he then pays to cast the Thought Vessel. He then pays to suspend his Soul Talisman and pass his turn. Patrick plays a Mountain for turn before he then pays 5 to cast the God Eternal Ronus. This then triggers his Elder once again, putting a land into play tap, which gains him a life. Fog then responds to God Eternal Ronus entering play by countering it with a Stubborn Denial. And in retaliation, Patrick swings his Dragon and Fog in the air for 5 damage while also paying to shoot his Logolife, sending him to the graveyard. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Sudden Edict targeting Patrick, forcing him to sacrifice his dragon. He then goes to combat and swings his commander at Fog this time for 3 commander damage. Fog draws for turn and then casts a Necrogen Rot Priest, before then paying 2 to cast a Shieldred's Edict, forcing each of his opponents to sacrifice a creature. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his commander at Patrick this time, giving him 6 commander damage and 3 poison counters. Fog then casts a Cold Eye Selkie and passes turn. Foil removes a counter from his Soul Talisman before then drawing for turn. He then pays 3 and casts a Commander Sphere, and another 3 for a Harvest Tide Infiltrator. Patrick plays a Mountain for turn and then pays 7 in order to cast a Dawnglade Regent, becoming the Monarch. Martin pays to create a creature on his end step and draws for turn. Martin then swings his created creature at Foil, who doesn't block, which then allows him to bring back Patrick's Flame Blast Dragon from his graveyard before scrying 2 cards at the bottom of his library. Fog draws for turn and then pays 4 to cast a Plague Nurse. He then goes to combat and swings his commander at Patrick, who blocks the Dawnglade Regent, and his Route Priest at Foil. Before damage is dealt, Fog then pays in order to cast Tyvar Stand, giving his commander +3/+3, hexproof and indestructible. Patrick then takes 1 trample damage, which gives him 3 additional poison counters and makes Fog the Monarch. Fog then ends his turn, drawing on his end step. Foil removes another counter off his Talisman before drawing for turn. He then plays a Force for turn before paying to cast his commander a second time, once again making it day. He then pays to cast an Unnatural Moonrise, which has daytime becoming nighttime and each of his werewolves transforming. Foil then goes to combat and swings his Harvest Tide Assailant at Fog, who thinks about blocking but then decides to just take the damage, which then has Foil becoming the Monarch and drawing on his end step. Patrick draws for turn and plays a Mountain while Foil transforms all of his werewolves back into humans. Patrick then pays to recast his commander, and on his end step, Martin pays to turn 2 more of his instants from his graveyard into creatures. Martin plays a Temple of Malice for turn, which has him scrying 1 card, keeping it on top of his library. He then pays 4 in order to cast a Rekindled Flame, which deals 4 damage, killing Foil's Plague Nurse. Martin then goes to combat, swinging Patrick's Flame Blast Dragon back at him in the air, while he swings 2 of his creatures at Fog and 1 creature at Foil. Patrick then takes his damage while Fog blocks one of the creatures and Foil blocks a creature attacking him. Martin grabbing the Dawnglade Regent out of Patrick's graveyard, which has him becoming the Monarch when he enters play. Fog draws for turn, before he pays 3 in order to cast a Frantic Search. Fog then plays a Swamp for turn before paying to give both of his creatures Death Touch and go into combat. He then swings his commander at Martin and his Route Priest at Foil. Martin then blocks with the Dawnglade Regent, but because of how Death Touch and Indestructible works, he still takes commander damage and gets 3 poison counters, while Foil doesn't block and gets 3 poison counters. Fog's commander then goes to the graveyard and he becomes the Monarch, drawing on his end step. Foil removes the last counter off his Talisman on his upkeep and casts it for free before drawing for turn. He then casts a Rhythm of the Wild and a Ferocious Pup that enters with a 1/1 counter and creates him a 2/2 Green Wolf creature token when he enters play. He then casts a Villagers of Estwald, which he also has interplay with the 1/1 counter on it, and on his end step, Patrick casts Return of the Wildspeaker targeting his commander in order to draw 2 cards. Patrick then draws for turn before playing a Sun Petal Grove, and then paying to activate his commander's ability. He then looks at the top 5 cards of his library and puts to play a Phyrexian Vindicator and bottoms the rest. He then pays to cast a Rampant Growth, which uses to go get a forest and passes. Martin pays 1 and casts a Lightning Bolt in order to take out Mayael, before he then goes to combat, swinging out with all of his creatures at Fog, taking him down to 3 life. Martin then becomes a monarch, and with 2 of his creatures dealing damage, he has Patrick sacrificing his Vindicator while he destroys one of Foil's werewolves and draws on his end step. Fog plays a Force return and then pays to cast his commander from his graveyard, mutating it onto his Raw Priest. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander at Martin, who in response, Martin pays to turn 2 of his cards in his graveyard into creatures, but it's still not enough to stop all the trample damage, so he dies to poison counters. Foil draws return and then pays enough to recast his commander a 3rd time, making it day once again. He then casts a Solitary Hunter, choosing to give both of his creatures haste before going to combat, swinging 4 of his creatures at Patrick and 1 creature at Fog. This then deals 8 damage to Patrick and is enough damage to take Fog out of the game, making Foil the monarch. Foil then draws on his end step and Patrick draws for turn. He then pays 1 for Lawnor Elves and then pays to cast Kamal, Heart of Kurosa. Foil draws for turn and then goes straight to combat, swinging out at Patrick. In response, Patrick pays to turn 1 of his lands into a creature and then blocks 3 of Foil's creature but still gets taken down to 4 life. Foil then casts a Sulfuric Vortex and draws on his end step. On his upkeep, Patrick loses 2 life, going down to 2. He then uses Kamal's ability to turn a bunch of his lands into creatures, and somehow, miraculously has enough damage in order to take Foil out of the game with combat. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.